Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Since 2011, Libya has been in turmoil. Since the ouster and killing of Muammar Gaddafi, there have been two rival governments in place. And that is now seemingly coming to a head, with General Khalifa Haftar marching on the capital, Tripoli. What will now next happen for Libya and going forward for Africa and North Africa specifically in general? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Cyril Widdershoven, who is the director of the Dutch consultancy Verasi. He's also a Middle East defense energy analyst, and he holds degrees in war studies as well. Cyril, thanks for taking your time out to join us here in Scope. What do you make of the situation right now in Libya? Since 2011, it seems it's been constant, hasn't it, turmoil?
Yes. Since 2011, it has been an ongoing issue. The main issues that we have been seeing is that there is a UN-supported government or faction in the West, and the East was looking for a strong man. It has taken almost until end 2017, beginning of 2018, until General Haftar, who was looked at by the rest as, okay, he is a general, but in how far is he able to do anything at all? He has been proving to Arab nations, to the Russians, and to the EU that he is a force to look at. His success in 2018 and 2019 was, for most of the analysts, not expected at all, because we all were saying, okay, it's a general, it's a faction, and how far is he able to deal with Daesh and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all the others. But
then, Cyril, if I may come in here for a moment, because, you know, you call him a strong man, and I think that's the term that I wanted to use for him as well. So I'm glad we agree on that point, because I wonder then, Cyril, if Libya is almost now going backwards, because the word strong man could have been used for Gaddafi too. So it seems like we're almost back to square one.
You can see this, I think, for almost any after Arab Spring areas. Egypt, the army, Algeria after, the army is still there, and in Libya, if I would be the devil's advocate, the country, looking at how it is right now, needs at least someone that is able to put some rest in the ongoing issues. And when looking at the GNA in the West, they don't have an army. They are only by words being supported by the UN and the US and others, and the only real option right now to deal with issues in Libya and bring the civil war, which has been going on since 2011, to an end in either a military option or by forcing himself into the discussion that the GNA is holding with the UN. There
Yeah,
Yes.
if I may come in for a moment, Cyril, because I do want to look forward. I want to look backwards, if we may, for a moment, and go back all the way to March 2011 when NATO got involved. With the UN Security Council at that time authorizing that no-fly zone over Libya to protect civilians. Do you think NATO made a misstep and a miscalculation at that time? Because, I mean, it can be argued that NATO countries have been almost hurt the most, haven't they? Especially where you're sitting and other places, around Europe, where a lot of migrants, asylum seekers, have been flooding Europe, at least in Europe's terms. And a lot of that obviously has to do with the instability in Libya.
You are right. First of all, if we say that NATO has been involved, NATO is just an organization which is led by the views of the respective governments in Europe or in the US. So they will follow what our leaders, our politicians see as being the right approach. Before the Arab Spring, there have been made some wrong assessments of where North Africa and the Arab world could be going if there would be an intervention or a support for so-called democratic opposition. While looking at which opposition at that moment was there in Libya or in Egypt or in Syria, you could have been questioning the democratic value of certain opposition groups. And by intervening and not being able or not being willing to not only intervene but also stabilize the area, we have been giving the opportunity that the Arab Spring became the Arab Autumn. The idea was right. The approach and the implementation ended up in the situation we are looking at right now. And looking at the area, democracy is an idea that needs to be learned, and it took in Europe 300 to 350 years. Do not expect by removing a party A that the rest is able to implement all the necessary frameworks and legal, etc., without going first through a phase of getting your revenge on the groups that have been doing things to you.
No, and that's a point, Cyril, the point you just made there about democracy is one that had been made, I remember, back when the Arab Spring hit Egypt, obviously, and in the aftermath, we've seen what's occurred there. But then many people, Cyril, would say and argue from this part of the world, at least the Middle East specifically, that would be almost, a degrading thing to say about people, because for many people, democracy and or freedoms are something that they all naturally aspire towards. So do you think it's actually to do with a lot of foreign intervention and interference in these countries? We can argue that that's the case even when it comes to Egypt, that there were a lot of countries even within the region that weren't happy about what happened there. So the same can be said about Libya, can't it?
I am sure that that's the case. Yes. Look, even in Europe, we have our own ideas, and some of the strategies that have been employed in 2011 and afterwards are linked to interests of EU, of the US, of Russia, of China, of Saudi, of the UAE, of Egypt. So yes, whatever is being done was not only linked to improving democracy. We as a global society always have our phase 2 and phase 3. And these things have been constraining the developments in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, etc. So we are not able to throw the first stone because we are also not, well, yeah?
Yeah, indeed. And Cyril, because you are an energy analyst, I'll ask you this directly. Do you think a lot of this interference in Libya has to do with its oil reserves? It is, it has quite large oil reserves, in fact, and it's a fairly wealthy country. In fact, even under Gaddafi, they say that, arguably, of course, distributed wealth fairly okay. But apart from that factor, just as a country itself, it has a lot of natural resources. Does that play into all of this interference then?
It plays into it. It plays for sure into it right now. You always can make the case if we have been interfering in Libya or Egypt or Iraq because of the oil. It's reasonably easy to understand that even 14 days before we intervened in Libya, Gaddafi was welcomed by several European leaders. So we had access to the oil, we had access to the gas. So there was no energy need to remove the strongman at that moment. However, when you look at what is going on since 2016 or so, or right now, for sure, whatever is being done, whichever European or Arab state or Russia or China is being involved, they are looking to the phases after that the situation has been cooling down. And then, of course, it's oil and gas.
Indeed. Okay, we're just going to take a very short break. I'm going to ask Cyril to stay with us as well. We're going to continue this conversation, a very vital one, of course, about the latest situation there in Libya. Stay with us, please. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to discuss the latest situation in Libya and, of course, General Khalifa Haftar's march on the capital, Tripoli. We're continuing to discuss this with Dr. Cyril Widdershoven, who is director of Dutch consultancy Veracity, and he's also holds degrees in war studies and is an energy analyst as well. Cyril, I want to continue with you and ask you then, looking forward, looking to the future, what do you think that European countries want to happen? I imagine that they obviously want the asylum seekers flow to stop. Do you think that they would then accept somebody like Haftar to take over power completely?
Of course, the asylum seekers or the migrant issue is playing in all a role. Looking at how we have been dealing with Egypt and with Turkey, I think that if there is a solution in which General Haftar can play a stabilizing role, and if he's able maybe to set up a working relationship in which he has a role with the GNA, then Europe will for sure directly involve Haftar as a strong leader in the Libyan future. They will be complaining for the next months or years about human rights and legal positions and the role of the military, for sure. But in reality, a secure, stable Libya is good for the people in Libya. And for sure, it will help to counter certain developments which the EU is struggling. And that's not only the continuing flood of refugees, but also the effect this has on the political situation in the EU.
Indeed.
And
Cyril, I apologize for interrupting your train of thought there, but I just wanted to get your final comments. And I wanted to ask you, Cyril, what do you think the lessons are from this situation in Libya? Is the lesson that the international community should not get as heavily involved? Because, you know, there are a number of disturbing trends right at the beginning of this protest movement, wasn't it? When Muammar Gaddafi was ousted, the manner in which he was killed, for example. Regardless of the fact, you know, that we can argue if he was a dictator or not, all of that is valid, but I'm talking about the fashion in which he was killed. So all of that is a disturbing trend from the get-go. Do you think that the international community should not have gotten involved, and that spoiled all of this for Libyans? And then what lesson are the rest of us learning, really, about democracy, human rights, freedoms, etc.?
I think that the lessons of Iraq and Syria and Libya have shown that before we intervene, we should assess this situation not from our viewpoint or our ideas, but we should do a thorough assessment of what will happen if we intervene. It has been shown that we have been focusing on how to intervene and not on phase 2, what will happen after we intervene. Yeah. So if we look at what the situation is right now, I would say only intervene when the majority, the overwhelming majority of a population asks for it, and also set up a structure, set up a discussion before you intervene, and don't always believe leaders from opposition parties which are living since 25 years in the European Union or the US, because
and that's a very good point to end off on, Cyril, and I do appreciate you making that point at the end, because I think that's a very valid one. We sincerely appreciate your time, your insight and analysis, Cyril. That was Dr. Cyril Widdershoven, who was speaking to us there. He's director of Dutch consultancy Verasi. He also holds degrees in war studies and is also an energy analyst amongst his many accomplishments. Cyril, we appreciate your time, of course, as I said. Now, one of the things that Cyril there said at the end, viewers, is an important one, and that is that before intervening in any country, and these lessons can be seen in Iraq as well, and many others around this region and the world, any country needs to properly assess the situation on the ground and cannot just believe those who have been sitting outside the country for decades or many years and just take them on their face value. They really need to do more on-ground study, and it seems that in Libya's case, NATO did not do that, the rest of the world did not do that, and that's why we're seeing the turmoil there now, where it seems at least that a strong man is being able to now march on the government capital there. What will happen in the coming days for Libya? What will happen in the coming days for Libyan democracy, human rights, freedoms? We'll wait and see, and we'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this short break. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. revoking the entry visa of the International Criminal Court's Chief Prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, and she was set to enter the United States to investigate possible U.S. war crimes. that have taken place in Afghanistan. This a long-standing case now, if we look back at the history of this. And of course, the United States is not a signatory at this point in time, that is, to the ICC statute, saying that, in fact, Pompeo has even warned of sanctions against the court if it goes ahead with this investigation into U.S. soldiers' actions in Afghanistan overall. So let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by our esteemed analyst, Professor of International Law, Professor William A. Schabas, who is joining us now from the UK. He's part of the School of Law there at Middlesex University. We're also joined by Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, who is joining us from Peshawar. He is a political security analyst and is an esteemed journalist and war correspondent in his own right. We will also be joined by Professor Tughral, Yamin, who is the Dean of the Center of International Peace and Stability, and he will be joining us from Islamabad. We appreciate all of your times to speak to us here in Scope. Professor William, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the revocation of Fatou Bensouda's visa? It's certainly a sign, isn't it? Not just of how Donald Trump approaches this, because it would be unfair to just put this on him, wouldn't it? George W. Bush, in fact, was the one who walked away from the ICC out of the fear of this very kind of investigation.
Yes, well, you know, at the same time, this measure, which is very upsetting and disturbing on the one hand, is a sign of weakness by the United States. I mean, this isn't really a very effective measure. And I think if this is the best they can come up with, it just shows they have very little with which to fight the International Criminal Court. They tried under Bush back in 2002. They launched an offensive against the court. Much of it backfired against the United States. And finally, later, not even before the end of Bush, because in the second Bush administration, the United States started to mellow to the court and become more cooperative with it. But of course, under President Trump, and particularly with his national security advisor, John Bolton, who is really a sworn enemy of the court, they're now trying such measures. But, you know, really stopping the prosecutor from traveling to the United States on a visa, is this really the best they can come up with?
Mr. Yousafzai, I wonder what you made of this move by the U.S. Is it almost an admission of guilt?
I think, you know, this will be the impression which will be created. You know, the investigation has not yet even started, and the Trump administration is already worried. You know, placing visa restrictions on this lady, you know, it actually, you know, reveals that something has gone wrong in Afghanistan. In fact, there have been such a high number of human rights abuses in the last 4 decades in Afghanistan. It's not only the Americans who are involved, you know, others also before them, the Russians, the Soviets, and then also the Afghan, you know, different armed groups, even the people in power. So I think, you know, there has been a demand that these human rights abuses should be investigated. And now that there's a move by the ICC to try to do something about it, the Americans won't allow it. I think it does not, you know, does not really reflect the U.S. statements and promises that, you know, it is against human rights violations, you know, it's supportive of democracy and all these things. I think this will create serious doubts about the U.S. intentions.
Okay, so Professor William, you know, the U.S. says, and I know this is a statement going back to George W. Bush, the reason he walked away from the ICC was because he thought that the court would be unfair to U.S. soldiers and servicemen serving specifically in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq, etc. Do you think that this court would go into such a case with bias in any way?
Well, the judges are elected. They're very responsible people of great integrity. There's no evidence that this is a court that there's nothing to suggest it would be unfair. Two of its biggest cases have resulted in acquittals. So these are judges who acquit people if they believe they're innocent. There's nothing. It's a fine court from that standpoint. I think the other point that is important to understand, the United States conducted their own agents in Afghanistan. So it's almost as if they don't need to conduct an investigation. We have the evidence. We just need to get the full Feinstein report and then put it on trial. The real problem with the United States is that they don't prosecute their own people, and they should be doing it. The evidence is that the United States that U.S. agents conducted torture. The United States has an obligation under the UN Torture Convention that it ratified. It's a member of the UN Torture Convention, and it has an obligation to prosecute people. If it does that, it has nothing to fear from the International Criminal Court, and it certainly doesn't have unfairness to fear from the International Criminal Court.
Okay, so let's add now Professor Tughral to this discussion. He is, as I said earlier, the Dean of the Center of International Peace and Stability, and he is joining us now from the Pakistani capital. Professor Yamin, thanks for joining us. What do you make, Professor, of U.S. actions in Afghanistan? Do you believe it should fear an investigation into its servicemen's actions there? As Professor William there was saying, its own investigations have shown that U.S. soldiers and others have carried out torture.
The Karzai government was very, very reluctant. They did not want this status of force agreement to be signed because the purpose of this so far was to give a blanket cover to the soldiers and diplomats working in Afghanistan. And the United States understands that their soldiers and their diplomats are not always overboard. We know that a lot of torture has taken place in places which are known as rendition places, and also in Guantanamo Bay. They have been doing this waterboarding stuff. So it is on record. So I'm not surprised that the Americans have revoked this visa of the ICC prosecutor. They will continue to hide any misdeeds that their individuals have done in Afghanistan, unfortunately.
So then, Mr. Yousafzai, then one wonders, what is the message that the United States is sending to all of us around the world, really? Is it that it wants to remain above the law and should be above the law for, many people would argue, Mr. Yousafzai, attacking and occupying a country?
I think no other country has become involved in the affairs of other countries as the U.S. And they have been launching military operations, bombing, their opponents in different countries. Whenever they, intervene militarily in a country, the first thing they do is to get some exemptions. They don't want their servicemen to be tried under that country's laws. So they are above the law in a way. And they say they will be tried in the U.S., which, actually may not meet the ends of justice. So that is the reason why the U.S. is fearful. Why would a country oppose the prosecution of war criminals? War criminals, wherever they are or to whichever country they belong should be prosecuted, if they are found guilty. I think that is the reason that the U.S. has intervened. It has the intention of again invading countries, bringing regime changes, That's why it does not want its servicemen, its officials to be tried. And, I think we have been following also the U.S. media. They actually think that John Bolton, he is the one who actually has led this campaign against the ICC. And, I think Trump also has the same wills. So we have these two people who don't want the U.S., to be made accountable. I think that's the reason.
Professor William, I wonder what you make of that. I don't want to sound like I'm just bashing the U.S. just for the sake of bashing the U.S., but certainly on one side, after 9/11, the U.S. would have argued, obviously, that it needed to do something to secure the homeland. But do you think that it was smart to go about it in this fashion when it came to Afghanistan, and then the ensuing actions that took place by U.S. forces and others can be argued in that country vis-a-vis, lack of respect for human rights laws, international laws, that is. What do you make of all that?
Well, that's a much broader question than just the International Criminal Court, of course. But the military interventions by the United States, we can start with Afghanistan, we can go further back We can talk about the more recent ones in Iraq and the involvement of the United States elsewhere in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya. The U.S. military hasn't done any good for anybody. It's generally just made matters worse in countries. To go back to the subject of international justice, there's a bit of a paradox about the attitude of the United States, because it has been a great friend of international justice in certain contexts. It was the biggest supporter of the Nuremberg trial. It was the biggest supporter of the Tokyo trial at the end of the Second World War. And in more recent times, it's been one of the most steadfast supporters of institutions like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
What the United States doesn't like is an institution that is properly independent and that it cannot control, because then it's vulnerable itself to being prosecuted. It wants other people to be prosecuted by international justice, but it doesn't want itself to be prosecuted. Well, who can blame them in a sense, except that you can't have a proper international institution that's independent and impartial if it doesn't have the ability to investigate and prosecute crimes committed by everybody.
Yeah.
If the United States doesn't want to be subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, it can do two things to protect itself, and it will protect itself 100%. The first is to prosecute its own war criminals, and the second is not to send its soldiers abroad. If it keeps its soldiers within its own borders, like most countries do, it doesn't have anything to worry about.
Professor Yamin, I wanted to go back to that point that Professor William there made about this paradox and about essentially the U.S. wanting itself to be above international law as well. That goes back to then the problem of international institutions, doesn't it? Such as even the UN Security Council can be argued, or even the ICC.
America has got its own set of rules, and it will do what it wants to do. It will resist any laws, or it will defy laws which will harm its interests. That is understandable. That is but natural. You see, many of the international organizations owe their existence to the United States of America. But the point is that from the moral point of view, from the ethical point of view, I think somebody discussed about the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, etc. At that moment in time, the United States of America was portraying itself as the leader, or the leader of the free world, and it continued to bear that mantle for a very long time. But I think over the last 10 or 20 years, ever since 9/11, they have literally given up on even the pretense of being fair, the pretense of listening to international bodies. They just go ahead and do what they feel like doing, because they think that in their current position as the lone superpower, there's nobody who can challenge them. And once we see multiple poles emerging, Russia or China and even other countries who can stand up and defy them, then that will be the day. Then perhaps they will either accept them as equals and stop being so overbearing, or perhaps they will start listening. I don't think that they will listen if it's their own personal interests are involved. That's my take on it. Yes.
Mr. Yousafzai, I wanted to get your thoughts, because it's interesting that as the U.S. has revoked the prosecutor's visa, it is also involved in the Afghan peace process and peace talks. And I wonder if you see an interesting paradox there as well, because I imagine, Mr. Yousafzai, that Afghans would look at this situation and say, if they cannot get justice for crimes done against them, then why would they accept the mediation of the United States?
I think there's no other way that the Afghan issue can be resolved. The U.S., is the biggest supporter of the Afghan government. It is militarily involved there for the last 18 years, It wants to leave now, as far as we know. And that's why it has to negotiate with Taliban. It's a sign of weakness, I would say, that, they were earlier refusing to talk to Taliban, and now they've agreed to negotiate with Taliban in the absence of the Afghan government. So I think it's a political need, and that's why they are negotiating. It's to also, in a way, find a face-saving, exit from Afghanistan. That seems to be the main reason, because there is no military solution now. But I think that, in Afghanistan, all these governments which came into power after the fall of Taliban regime in 2001, they actually were hand in glove with the U.S. So the U.S. was helping this government, strengthening it, sustaining it in power, and in return, they agreed to the U.S. terms and conditions. So, even after mass killings by some of these U.S. servicemen, including one in Kandahar, and so many innocent villagers were killed at night, nobody was tried in Afghanistan. They were tried in the U.S. And I think there has been a growing demand in Afghanistan that all these crimes should be investigated by everyone.
Yeah.
One of the first things which the Afghan ruling elite did was to secure amnesty from the parliament. So there was an amnesty given by the parliament that all these warlords, all these Mujahideen commanders, all these guys who were fighting and committing human rights abuses, they were given amnesty, which was criticized by many well-meaning Afghans. But the problem is that nobody has been made accountable. That's why there are still these crimes taking place. So I think the U.S. actions has actually emboldened the Afghans, the people in power, to commit the same kind of crimes without being investigated and convicted.
It's a very good point you brought up there, Mr. Yousafzai, because, Professor, I wonder if you agree with that last point that was made there, because certainly I imagine if international law, and I know you've been covering this international law issues around the world for many years, if international law is not followed, then it does embolden others looking on that they can also get away with murder and the like.
Well, yes, absolutely. But the fact is, this is not a case of people getting away with murder. The United States is objecting to the fact that there's an international organization that has 123 members that is investigating its activities and the accusations of torture. That should be people should find that a very exciting thing. That's something that the Security Council could never do or would never do because of the U.S. veto. It wouldn't be permitted.
Yeah.
Now we have an institution that's still a young institution, but it's able to do this. And I think that we should want to encourage the International Criminal Court. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, I think we should also be pleased to see that the United States actually doesn't have any effective weapons to prevent the International Criminal Court from operating. This is a pretty pathetic gesture by the United States to deny the prosecutor a visa.
But with due respect, Professor William, I do apologize for interrupting you just because I wanted to give you the final word. We have about a minute and a half left. If even the ICC were to pass a judgment, for example, against the U.S., it doesn't have jurisdiction over the U.S., so what can it really actually do to carry out any form of accountability?
That's an easy question. I mean, the International Criminal Court doesn't actually pronounce judgments against countries.
Okay.
It's a criminal court. It tries individuals, and it only tries them if they're present. So it would have to have somebody, an American citizen, in its own custody to hold a trial. Once it has them in their custody, then it can sentence them and it can carry out the sentence. So that may sound difficult, but Americans travel an awful lot. And some of them go to these 123 countries that are members of the court. They should. It may surprise us, but at some point in the future, we're going to see that justice will be done. At this point, we can say that there's an institution that's attempting to do it, and that's a very, very encouraging development internationally.
Indeed. And we'll leave that as a final word. And of course, we appreciate all times your insight and analysis, and of course, putting this all into context for us. So, Professor William A. Schabas, who's a professor of international law. We were also joined by Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, who is a political and security analyst. And we were also joined by Professor Tughral Yamin, who is Dean of Center for International Peace and Stability. And now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, there are various facets to this issue, but the first, of course, and the most obvious glaring part of all of this is the U.S. essentially is pouring, egg on its own face, really, by not allowing the visa for the prosecutor to at least begin her investigations. This is just at the early stages right now, and many would ask, what does the U.S. have to fear from proper justice, even even though its own investigations, as Professor William, I believe it was, said, has found that some of its servicemen did commit torture in Afghanistan. Why will the U.S. see itself as above international law in such cases? We'll keep a close eye on how all this develops in the days to come and what the ICC's next move will be in this case as well. But thanks for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.